adjective social in social doctrine is interesting because that adjective can mean quite different things. For instance, when two or more individuals enjoy a kind of intersubjectivity. Let's say we go to the opera and there are 200 people at the opera and the place is shot through. It's almost buzzing with intersubjectivity. All of us are aware that the other people in the audience are aware. We can kind of feel the excitement or the disappointment. It's as social as all get out, and very enjoyably so, but we're not put together in united action. We're not acting together. And a night at the opera surely has no intention on the part of any of the congregants to form a society. Here, the word social really does mean something. Two or more individuals aware that the other one is aware, but not acting together or having an intention to form a society. We can think of another meaning. I'd put it on a slightly higher grade, where we have two or more individuals who communicate and exchange, especially on relationships, social relationships that ensue upon market relations, economic work. A kind of society comes into being. Let's say the partnership, that we intentionally form a partnership, but for the sake of private yield. The purpose of the partnership is ultimately profit and private yield. It's not the only value, but that's the reason for which the partnership is formed. And there doesn't need to be a high degree of united action. In fact, the actions can be exchanged, and they can be exchanged from a distance. Hey, we're all doing this right now in our home offices. I'm sitting in my living room, doing business every week. I'm giving an action or doing a performance for the sake of some result, agreeable result, but there is no common life. We don't live together. We don't even have to be immediately working together. And these kinds of partnerships are revisable. Indeed, you can cancel them. But yet another meaning of social, two or more individuals, let's say, who form clubs, teams, associations, precisely for the purpose of enjoying common action. Think of an orchestra. Right? In some ways, it's irreducibly social because what is engaged, what's intended, and indeed what's enjoyed is the common action, and not from a distance. We can think of sports teams. I mean, I suppose that you can bowl alone. You can do it by yourself, but much more enjoyable to do it in a club and to do it together and to do it in a team. But even here, such clubs and associations do not constitute a common life. And they too are revisable and cancelable. And the fourth instance I'll give of something being social is where two or more individuals enter into a union that's loved for its own sake. This is what John Paul II called not just social subjectivity, like the night at the opera, but a social subject. A subject that transcends the sum of its parts. In his letter to families, few decades ago now. He wrote, "Just as the human person is a subject, so too is the family, since it's made up of persons who join together by a profound bond of communion, form a single communal subject. Indeed, the family is more a subject than any other social institution, more so than the nation or the state, more so than society and international organizations." So there are four. A day in the piazza, filled with social subjectivity, partnerships, usually for private yield, clubs, teams, associations, in which the united action and the performance is itself the thing enjoyed. In some ways, it's the most deeply social up to this point. And then individuals who actually enter into a society according to which it's the union that is loved. As Aquinas says in his commentary on Peter Lombard, the consent to be married is not just a consent to the person. I, John, take Jane. I, Jane, take John. It's a consent to the union with the person. Without an intention to love the union, you haven't really given the right kind of consent yet. And so the question arises, by the way, I just named four. We could probably name 10 other gradations of kinds of meanings of the term social. I just gave four important ones. The question arises, which are the most important? What should form the core, the basis? What constitutes the normative ontology of the word social? And many social scientists today, not all, but many, would hold that social, as is meant in links and networking, highly revisable memberships that are voluntary and transient, that allow diverse roles with minimal authority, if any. Those kinds of social associations are the most satisfying, and it's very good to have plural memberships. But a recent study, I think, calls this into question. It's really a groundbreaking study that came out 2015, the very December 2015, by the Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Deaton was a Nobel Prize winner. They set out to study the very high levels of mortality and morbidity in lower middle class and lower class white males in the United States. This is a group that has very high rates of suicide, depression, drug use, incarceration. They're trying to develop data sets showing what do these people have in common. And they came to this conclusion, that mortality and morbidity, high levels of it, move in tandem with withdrawal from marriage and children, domestic society, withdrawal from participation in religious congregations, and from withdrawal from political association. Like if you had to correlate high levels of mortality and morbidity among middle-aged white men in the United States, Angus and Deaton are suggesting they correlate with not getting it right with marriage and family, church, and political association. So if all of a sudden a wand were to be waved and all of these highly revisable associations, bowling clubs, book clubs, sports teams, and so on and so forth, were to all disappear, we would have a really big social problem on our hands. But if withdrawal from family, church, and polity were to happen, it would be a social calamity, a disaster. And I think this social science work of Angus and Deaton point us toward the answer traditionally that Catholic social doctrine has given about the word social and what should be the normative ontology of it. The ground. Because these three kinds of sociality, domestic, political, and ecclesial, have always been called societies of common life, or necessary societies, the three necessary societies. Necessary for what? Necessary for human flourishing, for happiness. Pius XI stated, "Now there are three necessary societies, that is, societies necessary for human flourishing, distinct from one another, and yet harmoniously combined by God, into which man is born. Two, namely family and civil society, belong to the natural order. The third, the church, to the supernatural order." And I think here he's doing a kind of a riff on Aristotle, who in the Politics says that that political association is born in necessity, but it completes itself in excellence. That is, the necessity that gives birth to polity, or now the necessity that gives birth to church, or the necessity that gives birth to marriage and family, if played out well, transcend themselves and become a necessity of excellence. And we could put it in this way. The human person is a political animal, a matrimonial and familial or domestic animal, and an ecclesial animal. Now, of course, there are revisable, transient associations that are subject to the free ingenuity and designs of human beings, all kinds of clubs and associations. But they're not the bedrock. The bedrock are societies of common life that if you were to fail in some serious and persistent way in being a political animal, a matrimonial animal, and an ecclesial animal, your prospects of eudaimonia are greatly reduced. These three necessary societies are irreducibly social. They all require a common action in which it's the union of the persons that is loved. In all, at least traditionally, in all three, membership cannot be bought or sold. Inclusion is either total inclusion or no inclusion at all. For instance, when I'm baptized, I am totally and inclusively baptized into the body of Christ. As an American citizen, I'm totally and inclusively a citizen of the United States. These societies are transgenerational. Now, it doesn't always work out that, at least with the natural ones, that they keep on ticking, but they're meant to. And they are indivisible. For example, even in our somewhat addled and confused legal culture, if a married couple goes to a court to procure a divorce, the magistrate knows what to do with the property, namely to divide it in some equitable way. But no judge would ever consider giving one of the former spouses 35% of the marriage and the other one 65%. A marriage is indivisible. You can't divide it, parcel it out. you either participate in it or you don't have it at all. Now, a couple of notes about necessity. Born in necessity, to use the Aristotelian understanding of this. Actually, all human sociality is born in some kind of necessity. Let's say neediness, some kind of neediness. Let me give an example. Every child has a neediness with regard to education, the very beginning of which is learning to speak. Like, the first thing the parents do for constituting the social relationship is to teach the child to speak, to teach the child how to communicate and to enter into the conversation of that society. Eventually, that child will learn how to speak and no longer be dependent on the parents for that education. In fact, if the parents don't educate the child to transcend the original neediness and dependence, the parents have not done a very good job. But it's precisely then that the child is able to assume a new role in the family structure of being a family member that's not just needy for the instruction, but the excellence of a family member who is capable of enjoying the social bond itself. Because the deepest level of social necessity, whether we're talking about marriage or family or politics or church, is the bond itself. It takes some time to develop an appreciation of the bond itself. But to be included in the life of another is the deepest necessity. And that should ensue upon the neediness. And if things go well, one reaches another level of social relations. By the way, this is exactly the argument that Leo XIII made in 1891 in Rerum Novarum. He begins with neediness. That is, one must work. And that the purpose of work is to sustain oneself materially, but also to sustain one's family, one's children, one's spouse. You must work. But the individual dignity in working begins to transcend. It doesn't do away with, but it transcends the original neediness, because we learn how to be a good parent. We learn how to be provident, not just for ourselves, but for the others in the family. We learn how, through work, not just to meet a need by an emergency response, but how to do justice in work and how to form bonds with others, including the justice in the larger community. But these three necessary societies, born in neediness but becoming schools of excellence in social bonding, are also schools of love. Because the scriptural tradition gives us the golden rule. It's the command to love one's neighbor as oneself that stands at the very nexus of love and justice. No human society of any sort can be sustained without being able to love others as one loves oneself. And sacred scripture begins with a Plutonian example of that, right? In Genesis 2. Adam loves Eve as bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, as another self. And as St. Paul says, another self. As a man loves his own body, so he loves his wife. Imagine the difficulty of going into wider society and all of the different modules of sociality and so forth without learning these excellences, including love of another as oneself, in these three necessary societies. And then the question arises, by the way, I've just given you 3 days of lectures here, is how these three societies are ordered one to another, which raises the issue of subsidiarity. But I'll leave that for next summer. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you in Krakow next year.